Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 1.4b, the brain and the brain structures. Here's your vocab, pause if you need to. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a lot of brain parts. I'm going to give you some mnemonics, some hand mnemonics, some like silly stories. I would encourage you to make a note of them and to play along with me. Like if I'm doing a hand gesture, do the hand gesture with me. That helps your brain remember it, okay? I'm giving you tips and tricks that are research-backed ways to remember. You have a lot of different parts of the brain to remember, and these are going to be helpful. I'm also going to really try to boil these things down to key words. If you go and Google these parts of the brain, you're not going to find what we're looking for an intro psych or AP psych class, okay? So just write down the definitions that I am providing and highlight those key words because that's what you want to think of. So let's first divide the brain into three main parts. The oldest part of the brain, the innermost part of the brain, the center of the Tootsie Roll Pop, is the hindbrain. So as it is the oldest part of the brain, it is essential for survival. So the hindbrain houses the parts of the brain that help us with breathing and heart rate and being conscious and not in a coma. Okay, hindbrain. On top of that, do these gestures along with me, is the midbrain. The midbrain keyword is transmit. This transmits information from that hindbrain, which by the way, this is our spinal cord that goes right into that brain stem, which is part of the hindbrain. Okay, so spinal cord into that brain stem, and that's the hindbrain. So that is going to bring information up from the nervous system through the hindbrain to the midbrain, and the midbrain is going to say, oh, that's visual information. It should go here. It's auditory. It should go here. It's going to transmit. Finally, if you had a partner, the final hand gesture would be someone keeps doing this. The other person goes like this around it because it's the outermost layer. It is the most complex. It is where we are most evolved as an animal. And that is the forebrain. So complex cognitive activities happen here. So let's look more at that brainstem. So remember, spinal cord, brainstem. And at the top of the brainstem, by the way, is the thalamus. This is not part of the hindbrain. It's part of the forebrain. But the rest of this here is part of the hindbrain. So first, the medulla. This is for breathing, heart rate. Those are the key words. Pons, coordinating movement and controlling sleep. Okay? Just keep it simple. Next, we have Thad the mailman. So Thad the mailman, again, is on top of the brainstem. He's getting that sensory information. He is a mailman. He is just going to deliver the info where it needs to go. So Thad the mailman is delivering all sensory information except for smell. He does not do smells. Smells do not come through this way, okay? They come through the olfactory bulb, which we'll talk about in another video. So Thad the mailman is walking around delivering sensory information with no nose. Imagine Thad the mailman just has an open cavity here where he should have a nose. He can't deliver smells, but he delivers everything else. Next in the brainstem, we have the reticular formation. And the key thing that I want you to remember about the reticular formation is that it regulates us being conscious. Like even when we are asleep, the reticular formation is active, allowing us to wake up when different circumstances require that. If our reticular formation is damaged, you would remain in a coma. You would be unable to gain conscious awareness. So it's not where we're doing our thinking and planning. Like that's not the consciousness I mean. It's about being awake or asleep. Next, we have the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, if this is our brainstem and spinal cord, the cerebellum is over here. So it's in the back here, sometimes called the little brain because it kind of does look like a little brain, right? And it's part of that hindbrain when we break it down to three main parts. And I want you to think here, balance and coordination. Okay, so anything to do with procedural learning. If you are a skilled athlete, let's say that you are a dancer, a baseball player, soccer, whatever your athletic skill might be, or it's okay if you don't have them, you're still using your cerebellum, by the way. You're still walking, you're still coordinating hands, feet, all the things, okay? But let's just use an athlete for an example, right? That is a procedural skill. Let's say you've become a really good baseball player. You learn how to swing a bat. It's really about, it's procedural. It's a skill. So that when you get up to bat, you're not thinking about every single movement with your hand, your eye, the coordination of it all. Your brain is just telling your body what to do. That's because of your cerebellum. Okay? The dancer, you know certain moves without conscious awareness. You can be thinking ahead about something else because your cerebellum has that procedural memory. So it's procedural memory related to like walking, to riding a bike, to some sort of skill of balance and that requires balance and coordination. So next we have the limbic system. So the limbic system has our emotions, our drives, and our memory. This is located mostly in the forebrain, below the cerebral hemispheres, which we'll talk about next. So there are 5 parts to the limbic system, and I'm going to go through each part in the next few slides. First, we have the amygdala. Amygdala keywords are fear and aggression. If you remove the amygdala, if you lesion the amygdala, you will be more docile, less aggressive, okay, less fearful, and just very like subdued. If you stimulate the amygdala, more aggression, okay, more fear. The limbic, so also in the limbic system is the hypothalamus. So all of these are part of like motives and drives, right? Our amygdala, fear and aggression, it's gonna motivate us to act in that, like it's gonna sound the alarm. It's fight or flight time, okay? The hypothalamus is going to activate for 5 motives that either keep us alive or keep the survival of the species. So in all of the psych textbooks, they call it the 4 Fs. And for funsies, my class and I a few years ago added the 5th one because that's just makes it easier. There's another F that we can connect it to. So the textbooks talk about fighting, feeding, fleeing. So you have fighting and fleeing is you're activating your fight or flight. Feeding is for hunger, mating, and the last one that we added was furnace. And this is for regulating homeostasis, regulating your body temperature. Okay, so here they are listed there. So hunger, thirst, your endocrine system, your sexual behavior, body temp, the 5 Fs, okay? And why is it called hypothalamus? To complicate your life, right? It's because it's it's below the thalamus, and so hypothalamus. It is really important for these functions and drives, and they're connected to our reward system. Why are we motivated to do these behaviors? Because of a reward system. Well, what is the neurotransmitter related to reward? It is dopamine. So we have this dopamine reward pathway in our brain, in our hypothalamus, and there is something called the nucleus accumbens, which we realize is a key part of this reward center. So it's located right in front of the hypothalamus. And so this area of the brain is where we see a lot of dopamine activity. So those 5 activities that we just spoke of that the hypothalamus regulates, they are going to give us that pleasure reward neurotransmitter to tell us to do those things again. Do that again, okay? So again, it's not happiness, right? It's do that thing again. And 2 neuropsychs accidentally found this, that they had a button that activated this part of the brain, this dopamine pathway. And these rats would push this button until they collapse. They would not drink water. They would forgo food. They will push this button until they absolutely crash down. Okay, so think about someone who's really activated that dopamine center with using something like illicit drugs, right? They will forgo all other things that you would think that a human would want to do to survive, to be happy. And it's not about happiness. The drug isn't bringing them happiness. It's hitting that dopamine reward pathway. It's hitting that dopamine button. Also in the limbic system, we're talking about the hippocampus. That's the memory part of the limbic system. And the hippocampus is not where we store all memories. Specifically, it's new memories. So I want you to remember a hippo on campus, and he's got his camera and he's taking pictures. He is making memories. A hippo on campus making new memories. So this is our explicit memories. And again, it's forming new memories. It's not where we store all memories. Next level of the brain house is our cerebral cortex. So this is part of the forebrain. This is that outer layer, and this is where those more complex thoughts are happening. And this is where we're exchanging information with all of the areas. And there's some fun facts about it, how much activity and how many nerve cells are going on in that part of the brain. So if we were to break the cerebral cortex down into 4 different parts, we would have these 4 lobes. So we have the frontal lobe, and this is our little memory cue for frontal lobe. We're going like this because not only is it located here, but it's also responsible for planning, judgment, and decision making, right? So if you're like, that is a good question. What should I do? Frontal lobe, judgment, decision making, planning ahead. Next, you want to go like this. You are shampooing your hair. This is your parietal lobe. This is touch and body position, right? So when you're shampooing your hair, you're scrubbing, you're touching your scalp and massaging your scalp. So we want to think parietal, shampoo, touch. Occipital, you hit yourself in the back of the head, you see stars. Occipital, vision. All visual information is processed there. And the last one, temporal, I want you to think headphones, or you go like this, right? It sounds different. So this is, temporal is for auditory information. So in the frontal lobe, but towards the back, so near the parietal, we have the motor cortex. The motor cortex controls voluntary movement. So does this work in coordination with the cerebellum? Of course, your whole brain is working together when you're doing lots of things. But the motor cortex is responsible for those voluntary movements that you are, in conscious awareness of. And then another thing I want to point out is that we are able to create cognitive neural prosthetics, meaning they can create a limb for you. If you lose an arm, right, they are able to create a limb that works with your brain. So all you have to do is, hey, I want to move my arm and wave high, like you normally would. And that information is able to connect to that prosthetic and make that prosthetic work to play video games, to use a computer, to do all sorts of things. So the technology is really cool when we understand the brain and we can actually use it to help people in that way. Next, we have the somatosensory cortex. This is located in the parietal, but see how it's right next to the primary motor cortex, which is in the frontal? It's because these two, again, everything is working together here, but there's some good planning out in our brain design here. The somatosensory cortex is going to process body touch and movement sensation. Does that sound a lot like what I told you the parietal lobe does? Yes, because again, you are not in a class where you are being a neurosurgeon right now. Maybe that's your future. That's awesome. I encourage you to pursue that path. But for right now, we're going for basics of what each part of the brain does and its purpose. So this is just a part of the parietal lobe, which means there are other parts in the parietal lobe that do other things. So the somatosensory cortex, touch and sensation. So if you stimulate a point on top and a person feels like they're being touched, you can just stimulate the brain. And the person would assume that they're actually being touched in that specific part of the brain that's being stimulated. So if you look at this diagram here, it's showing you, well, how much of our brain is devoted to sensation of touch in our foot and our toes? Not very much, because when you look over here, Look how much is devoted just to hand or just to these parts of our face, right? Including our tongue. These are really, really sensitive to touch and sensation. And this is evolution. There is an evolutionary purpose for this. Think about how much we need to use our tongue for eating, for speaking, for all of the things. So in our hands, the same thing. And this is Homunculus. He shows you like a visual of like how much, if you were to kind of show in size, how much goes to ears or lips or tongue or hands. Look at how much hands, right? So a lot of our somatosensory cortex is dedicated to those parts. So now let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. That is the specific part of the frontal lobe way up here at your forehead. That is our judgment and planning part of our brain specifically. So we've had case studies where we've had people injure this part of their brain and they're more impulsive. They're less able to kind of plan ahead. This is also where like executive functioning is happening here. Okay, next we have Broca's area and Wernicke's area. I think I changed the order of these. That's why it says still association areas. So this is an association area, but they are so what Wernicke's is located here in the auditory cortex and Broca's is located here in the frontal lobe. But near the motor cortex, right? Because Broca, I want you to think of a broken doll. So imagine a doll that talks, right? One of those little dolls that's like, Mama, I love you, whatever. A little doll said. I don't know what little talking dolls say anymore. I have boys and they don't have these dolls. But imagine that we take that little doll, that little talking doll, it's so cute, and we snap its neck. Okay, why am I giving you this visual? Because I want you to remember broken. Broca's area, broken doll. What happens when the doll breaks? It cannot speak. Broca's area is responsible for speaking. It's what allows us to say the words. Now, if we're looking for understanding of language, maybe your Broca's area is not damaged. You can speak words, but for those words to make sense, that is Wernicke's area. The patient can talk, but the words do not make sense. There's Broca's aphasia. So that's something that can happen, for example, during a stroke. The patient cannot understand language, but can speak it. That's Wernicke's damage. Okay, so those are just some association areas, meaning that they work together. What is an association area? It's just something that is not involved with like a primary function, but it's integrating different information. It's getting stuff from auditory and visual and prefrontal, and it's the connecting neurons that make those, that integrate that information, because you need not just taste and smell and visual information and that judgment thinking, that you need all of those together, right? To make a decision about what you're next going to do or to have that thought or feeling. We know that Einstein, while he had a typically sized brain, he had a large and unusually shaped parietal lobe and these association areas. So that mathematical spatial reasoning that was happening in those areas looked different for Einstein, which is interesting. Some parts of the parietal lobe, when stimulating, make people think that they moved when they didn't move. I already talked about that. Brain surgeons can stimulate a certain part of our association area near our motor cortex, and people move but didn't know they moved. I wrote the same thing twice. Okay, so what association areas do essentially is functional connectivity. They connect different parts of our brain so they communicate and work together on various tasks. Okay, so here's a case study that I kind of mentioned before, but not specifically. Phineas Gage is an important case study. He was a railroad worker in 1848. He was laying down railroad, and you pack the gunpowder into this thing, and it's supposed to help build the railroad. Well, it exploded, and the rod that he was using went through his head, right? Like, so you can't really see well in this picture, but see how his eye is not functional because it went through here and it came out here, and he lost a teacup size of brain. A teacup size of brain. And they thought he was dead. He lost a lot of brain. He lost blood. He lived. Okay, he lived for decades after. And this man was in line to become this important like manager, supervisor. But what they noticed about Gage was while Gage was still alive and functioning, Gage was no longer Gage. He started acting different. He was more impulsive. He was less like this cheerful, happy guy. He was more impulsive. And so this kind of was one of the first looks into, before there was the technology for it, to see how that part of the brain affects our planning, our judgment, and like our impulsivity. So takeaways, remember those 3 parts of the brain. Remember brainstem, think survival. Limbic system, think drives, motivations, memories. Hippocampus is making new memories. The 5 F's for the hypothalamus. Remember the cerebral cortex. And we can break that down into 4 different lobes. Remember those. The motor cortex is voluntary movement, which is different from the cerebellum. The association areas, that's where everything is integrated. That's that high level busy bee area. Phineas and his chunk of brain. Broca, broken doll. And remember, our brains can modify and grow. We've already talked about that in a different mod. All right, that's it for mod 1.4b. I will see you guys in class.